Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Stefan Kesting from grapplers.com. We're here with Jeff Shaw from Bellingham BJJ. And importantly, we're here with Luke Thomas. Luke, I think it's fair to say that you are one of the premier commentators on MMA and Combat Sports Act today. And thank you for your analyses. You were recently had a very short appearance on a long Jordan Klepper segment talking about the MMA to MAGA pipeline of how young men are becoming radicalized and how the role that the UFC plays in that. And you were on for maybe a minute or two, but I know how television works, and I'm sure that there were hours of recording that went into coming up with a magic 1 to 2 minutes of output. What was that like? Am I right about that editing?
Yeah, you're for sure right about it. First of all, thank you for having me on the program. I really appreciate it. It was great. I mean, the producer from The Daily Show hit me up, I don't know, maybe a month before the recording. The recording was done maybe a month or two before the broadcast. So this was like, late winter or something like that. And they're like, we're working on this segment for these reasons, and we want to see if you want to talk to us. I was like, sure. What's kind of interesting is some of the other names they told me they were trying to lock down that I never saw in the finished product. So I don't know if they didn't talk to them, but they, one way or the other, didn't use them. It's kind of interesting who didn't get put in based on what I heard. But okay, that notwithstanding, it was great. They were very friendly people. They had me over at their studio on the west side of Manhattan, and we spoke for like a couple of hours and some change. It actually was about everything you could possibly imagine: the history of the UFC, good and bad, the history of regulatory growth to match the growth of the UFC, good and bad, and the current state of the monopoly, the current state of the product, but then also some of the things that you saw more closely spelled out in the final piece there. And yeah, I mean, they're trying to get the very, very best stuff. What's kind of interesting, and I explained this to someone else before, this makes total intuitive sense, because if you're talking about something like, let's say, The Tonight Show, there's going to be a team of writers who write jokes, right? So Jordan Klepper, like through the whole conversation, is dropping jokes all the time. 90% of them, 95% of them don't make it in. But a lot of times what happens is the producer will come running into the room and like give him a joke, and then we have to restart again as he like asks me the question, he gets the answer, and then puts the joke behind it. So it was kind of interesting about like watching like you forget it for a moment, it's a comedy show, but then that was a reminder. So all in all, like a cool experience, I suppose.
It is strange how comedy shows are providing some of the best news reporting of on today's events in a way that many news organizations aren't. And I would include Klepper's show on that as well.
But they're just, I think they have a little more flexibility to kind of go in a way that more traditional corporate news just doesn't have. I mean, they've got the bandwidth for it, but they simply don't have the appetite. Nor I don't think they see their mission in that regard. But it leaves an enormous amount of blind spots. And I think a show like this, even though it's obviously corporate into a strong degree as well, still has more editorial latitude to find the stories that are actually important before they become real big. Although this one became kind of important after an event happened, and then it kind of dawned on everyone that there was this bigger problem. Not so much to insiders of the sport, but certainly to, like, clearly the Daily Show is picking up on it now, right?
Which event are you referring to?
The election of Donald Trump.
Okay.
And of course, I mean, the MAGA connection between that and MMA had been established long before that, but the fact that it was such a valuable portion of the electorate that actually got Trump back into office. I mean, when I go through like the sort of the top line stories about what are some of the bigger stories about what the significance of this election means, at least domestically for electoral politics, the fact that young men were not the deciding vote, but that they were much more electorally significant than imagined, and that the UFC and MMA more broadly had a relationship to this, people are clearly drawing the connection now.
Could you talk about the history of MAGA and the UFC?
That's a big one. I mean, I think what I would say is a couple of things. It's really worth noting that I believe that things that are like hyper masculine, like MMA or combat sports, or other things that I've been a part of in my life, military service, these are just parts of the world that just tend to be right-leaning. I don't know if it's a chicken or the egg kind of thing. I'm sure there's research to this effect that can, tease out these things more specifically. But in my time in shooting clubs, in my time in the military and in my time in combat sports, it's always had a rightward bent, and I think we have to just be honest about that fact. And I say that neutrally, like I'm just trying to be honest about like what the majority of these people are who comprise this group. Where do they is there a political valence to that? And there is, and it's right leaning. So that's the first thing I would say. I think the second thing I would say is it didn't seem to matter all that much relative to what it is now. Back maybe in certain times, like circa 2012 or so, or maybe even before that, where I don't know if you guys recall this, Jacob Volkman was a UFC welterweight for a time, and he made a joke about, it was a terrible joke, about giving Obama, who was president at the time, a glassectomy. I mean, it's literally the worst joke you've ever heard in your life. But what was kind of interesting about it was the Tonight Show picked up on it because he actually got a Secret Service visit for it, because they were like, is he making a threat to, how they visit anyone who they perceive makes any kind of seemingly specific threat. And, you got glimpses back then that it was this kind of nascent thing there, but it just didn't become so unambiguous as the link between them. Like, certain sports are pretty right coded. It's not coded in MMA. It's explicit, right? It's like they're unified. So maybe you could make the argument that there was this larger, broader change in right-wing politics in the country, and that you just see that through the UFC in a certain kind of way based on the demo and some of the decisions by leadership. You could maybe also put a bookmark at 2016 and say, when Dana White spoke at the Republican National Convention, if you go back and look at the message, it was very generic. It wasn't anything specific along clear like this policy, that policy. It was very generic. But that you could maybe use that as like that was the canary in the coal mine kind of thing. So to me it's like MMA absolutely plays a role in a number of key respects from in right-wing politics. But I think one thing you also just have to kind of realize is there was a bigger change in right-leaning politics in this country and in the demos that comprise it, and then that just bled out into everything, and you just saw that kind of, I don't know, repurposed in a certain way through the MMA world.
How do you mean, or what do you mean by a bigger change in right-wing politics?
I mean, this is a thing that's been happening, I think, on the left and the right, but like the insane, okay, how do I explain this? I've just never seen it where your entire identity in all the various dimensions, seemingly unrelated to anything that has to do with a particular view in politics, it's all now part of core identity. So where you shop, what kind of music you listen to, do you like the gym? What do you live in a city? Do you not? What part of the country do you live in? Who are your friends? Like, these things are now all much more intimately connected to a single political identity. And I think that the left has gone through its own version of that, but the right version is kind of the one that we've sort of seen, the growth of MAGA, this like very much in your face, to a strong degree, trolly, adversarial, but then proudly this almost like in-group protection of what the identity means. That to me is relatively new. That is, in the course, I'm 45 years old. In the course of my life, I've never seen it quite that way. Do you shop at Whole Foods? Do you not? These are actually things that can sort political opinion now. And that bigger change has nothing to do with MMA. What I'm saying is all of that got pushed into MMA. And then I think various stakeholders involved try to use that in a more direct way.
I think you're absolutely right that it's a broader political and identity issue. And one thing that I find interesting, in addition to the identity formation itself, is the way that these things are coded into constituency groups. So even if these groups are right coded, which they largely are, and I suspect if you did opinion research, you'd find that, what's interesting is the way the UFC's marketing strategy has sort of begun to coalesce around that. Like you mentioned Volkman, the example that I always think of is when Miguel Torres made a joke that could be interpreted about being a sexual assault. He was immediately gone, like never to be heard from again. And now you have somebody like Bryce Mitchell that's openly praising Hitler, and and Dana White calls him an idiot, but nothing happens to him. And something that I'd love to get your take on, I've always kind of thought, and this happens in political parties, where we can either broaden the base and appeal to more people in order to get our strategy of constituency groups, or we can focus in intently on the people that we think are our core audience and already agree with us. It's the Big Ten approach versus the really like the more sort of like focused approach. And I think the UFC went through a period of trying to have broad appeal and mainstreaming, and now have sort of maybe doubled down on, okay, these are our people and these are who we're talking to.
This is exactly what it is. It's kind of funny, actually, and it actually also has relevancy to the way the product works now. But just to get to your point, I was making this exact point in a different way to a friend recently. I'm like, let me tell you something. MMA is in a different place when it's telling certain fans it doesn't want them, because I was there for the days when they would take anybody, and especially if it was like a strange demographic, like, grandmas or so. Oh, they would have been delighted, even not as a full-on representative thing about who watches the program or who watches the events, but just to be able to say, hey, look, this is grandma approved. This was a source of pride to break into all these different parts of sporting and then broader society, to welcome all these people in. And that is absolutely not the message today. The message today is, you could stick around if you want, but it's certainly not going to be hospitable for you. But what's kind of interesting about that, at least in terms of the way the present product works, is there's a brilliant journalist in MMA called John Nash, does a lot of work on the business and legal side of the sport. And one point that he has made pretty recently is like, okay, so we know that pay-per-view buys are down year over year, as a matter of fact. Now, the UFC is still expected to sign a very lucrative new broadcast deal. And what's kind of interesting is look at ticket prices. They're still really high. They're still pulling amazing numbers. So there's still something to the idea of this product being coveted. And it's because there's some thought now that it's less about, yes, they want a better event versus a worse event, of course, but it's really kind of a lifestyle purchase. Again, it's an identitarian purchase. It's a purchase into a club where it signals to a set of people that I guess you want to signal to, you're kind of part of the club. And that's why they're not throwing quality out the window, but they're playing a little bit looser with it than they once did. It's a shift in, we want to welcome everyone to, this is what we're really focusing in on, and this is about us.
Yeah, all of that makes sense. And, and we can talk about, it's really interesting to see the shift between the early UFCs, which is very much an outlaw sport, and one that, although certainly wanted audience, it was more of an advertisement for jiu-jitsu at that time. And to see it become a much more, you see a lot of attention paid to it as a consumer product, where there's a lot of incentive for, it's always been about violence, but we want people to stand and bang. We want knockouts. We're going to have rules that are like anti-jiu-jitsu rules, I would say, which is like, well, if you're on the ground and you're not actively working to finish, we're going to stand you up. And it kind of it kind of accentuates the more ruthless aspects of the sport in my view.
There is some concern around that. I will say though, I have done. This isn't to say I've arrived at any kind of enlightened position to make no claim whatsoever, except to say I've gone through a lot of change, in my opinion, based on the way I've thought about it and the evidence that I've encountered. I don't in any way discount the thesis. The fact that Dana White has personally put effort into a power slap brand kind of tells you, it sort of gives the game away in terms of like the preferences that might be there, but in defense of the way that the sport runs now, there are pressures, I do think, around letting jiu-jitsu kind of breathe in certain contexts. But I will tell you that the more I've watched MMA, and I'm up on a long time this year, I actually feel like the rules are starting to get it right. And in fact, I believe that stalling is a massive problem in MMA, and the rules incentivizing getting around stalling would improve the sport dramatically, and I think are due based on the way jiu-jitsu and to another extent wrestling is kind of gamed. That's not exactly what you asked, but I do feel like, I guess I'm trying to say that there is some kind of case to be made that is not directly in line with competitive pressures for the average audience that I think are good for the sport.
So, as a combat sports analyst, would you include power slap as a combat sport?
No, I don't think I would. I know that they claim that there are tactics where, like, you can kind of clench your jaw and, work on your neck muscles and things like that. But, this seems to me a very tenuous connection to the notion of defense. And And for me, you know, like just holding your head as strong as you can or whatever the techniques are to minimize a direct hit. You know, it's kind of funny, right? Like in the Marine Corps, I did artillery. Artillery is not a direct hit weapon. You do not need it's an area weapon. Like you do not need to make, in fact, it's like, they're like, yeah, if you can make direct contact, great, but that's not what we're after. We're after getting just a close enough within the blast radius to have an effect. That's it. You know, because defense in the real world is, you know, difficult, but also important and part of the game. And to say nothing of like who's comprising this. I mean, the reality is, I think everyone probably watching this has some idea that this is what's going on, but it's, you know, they're just this is the best way to illustrate this. Yeah. Relative to boxing, MMA has no real federal regulation. I mean, there's federal laws about certain things, but there's no direct federal regulation of it. And Power Slap has probably even less than that. I mean, to the UFC's credit, to an extent, they tried to get it legalized or sanctioned through athletic commissions, but you know, along the same kind of lines that follow the that sort of what you see in MMA. And now they also want to get into boxing, but of course there is direct reporting that they want to change federal legislation to be able to create their own titles, and probably we'll see what else they put in there. Like they want to change the rules of the game in a sport that has proper regulation. It's like they had a choice about which one they wanted to get into. Yeah, I mean, one's Dana White, one's TKO. It's not one for one. But the fact that they want to change the rules of boxing kind of tells you like what this is really about is something that there's very little regulation of. They can have, you know, vast amounts of control, and in boxing, that's just much harder to come by.
Well, of course, now the UFC is also dipping into the jiu-jitsu space as well. So we'll see what happens.
Do you follow Craig Jones on social media?
Yes, I do.
I mean, even just before we started recording, he had a photo up on one of his stories of Don King, and then I'm trying to go off memory on the caption, but it was like, you know, hold on, I'm going to pull it up right here. I've got it right here. I want to see it, because he's making some point about how you're an independent contractor, but at the same time you're stuck to their contract, and so but you don't get any employment benefits, but you still owe them. So here he goes: independent contractors with exclusive deals, best of both worlds for the insert organization name. He doesn't mention them. No employee rights, and they can't work for another company. And then it's just Don King. You know what I'm saying? So he's getting after it.
I mean, it's very reminiscent, or not reminiscent is the wrong word. It really brings it to focus the various lawsuits against the monopoly practices of the UFC. The fact that this is now, people are actively concerned about this same thing happening to jiu-jitsu.
Did you hear about the two new ones?
How recent?
Oh, last week.
I might have seen something and assumed it was more news about the pre-existing one.
No. They have upped the ante in a pretty significant way. I mean, we don't have to get into the whole details of it, in part because I still haven't read the full text of the second lawsuit, but two lawsuits, two new ones. Now, one kind of is connected to the old one, but one is totally brand new. But the one that's kind of connected is from Misha Serkinov, former 205er Canadian, I believe, if memory serves. He is suing as basically to challenge their arbitration clauses, as well as, what was the other part? He's challenging arbitration, and there's another part of the deal he's trying to challenge. I think some part of the contracts. But that one is attached to the Cajun Johnson lawsuit, which is part of the sort of the second part of the original one. The other one is from Phil Davis, who is now a former UFC light heavyweight, now a PFL heavyweight, former Bellator champion, Division I national champion. It's kind of funny. He had faded from the limelight to a pretty significant degree. Anyway, the same people who represented, you know, Kung Lee and all those folks are representing him. He's suing, making a claim, two things. One, that the UFC's monopoly practices have had significant harm on him because he can't, you know, vie for wages that have essentially been bid up by promoters, because there is no ability to bid up. There's no ability for any promoter to really engage in any kind of active competition. It's been utterly eliminated from their monopoly practices, and so therefore I've suffered harm in pay. And then another question about, you know, what it's done to other organizations and how they can't get anything going. And what he's asking for is not a penny, zero money. He's asking for, they're calling it's basically called injunctive relief, but basically to turn UFC contracts renewable after a year. This would be revolutionizing to the industry. This would be, I don't use the term game changer very often. Again, they just put the lawsuit in. The last one's been going for a decade. Let's see what happens here. But positing a world where that happens, that transforms MMA.
How does it transform MMA? Spell it out for the people who haven't been following these series of lawsuits.
Yeah, I mean, this is real simple to understand. People think it's more complicated. It's really not. At any given time, there is always going to be, and this is true in the history of boxing, and it's true in now in MMA, at any point in time, there's going to be a group of fighters or athletes that the public widely considers to be the guys, right? These are the ones that matter. These are the ones that I should pay attention to. These are the ones that have worth and credibility. And what UFC does is they create their own titles. So, for example, if you are currently with Bob Arum in boxing and you're the WBC champion, if you go sign with another promoter, let's say Oscar De La Hoya, you're still the WBC champion. You take that title with you, and that gives you a lot of value on the open market to be able to negotiate a higher price due to the status that has been conferred upon you, right? If you leave like Francis Ngannou, you have to leave the belt, right? You have to go to PFL because you're not the UFC champion anymore. So there's a part of that is kind of involved. That's why they want to have their own titles. But the bigger issue is they want to keep guys under contracts for very long periods of time so they can never really test themselves on the open market. Now, you wouldn't be able to solve the problem of having their own title. However, if you were able to get a renewal every year or every 2 years, you would constantly be able to enter the market in a way where now what happens is the PFL can sign a bunch of UFC guys, and now our rosters we can actually battle this out. And if your guys win, now status is conferred upon them. But if the rosters never merge, if they never co-promote, there is never any way for any competitor to ever establish legitimacy in the eyes of the public. It cannot happen. There's no transfer mechanism. So you can put up a gazillion dollars into the PFL and you can have quality fighters. It doesn't matter. If the public can't see them tested against UFC guys, you'll never get that legitimacy. Putting 1 year or 2 year stipulations on contracts explodes a significant disruption to that, or creates, I should say, a significant disruption to that.
That makes perfect sense. And like, I don't know if you watch One Championship or follow One very much, but I'm very interested to see, hopefully that lawsuit is successful, and especially as One runs more cards in America. I think that, more competitors in the market just are better for the fighters, right? More places to ply your trade, more abilities to get that legitimacy with the public, and nobody benefits. Unregulated markets create monopolies. Monopolies destroy competition. It's a tale as old as time.
Well, if I can be honest with you, I think the damage is a little bit done here. Now, PFL is hanging around, and they've got some quality fights coming up, but they've got a lot of other problems just independent of the broader circumstances. I think their curse is that in order to get money from venture capitalists, they had to say, hey, okay, we're not the UFC, but we'll have a tournament system, like, real sports and all this stuff that doesn't matter to MMA fans one iota, but to a venture capitalist who doesn't know any better, like, yeah, sure, I'll give you $300 million because this is different from the UFC. But the problem is that locks them into a concept that has no value to the MMA fan whatsoever, and is in fact actually a detriment to being a consistent product. We're now in July. They had a one title fight in January and then nothing since. It's insane, right? Like that system has messed up their whole product, but they're hanging on for the time being. But One, I've heard, is in a little bit of trouble. They've significantly dialed back their MMA profile. They still have consistent shows with like 4-ounce Muay Thai, which is kind of an interesting twist. But I've heard that, like, yeah, it's not too great over there. And again, it's the same kind of thing. How does your roster gain legitimacy with the public if you can never get access to the thing that is the only thing that can grant you legitimacy? Like, you're just burning money and waiting for the clock to run out.
Yeah, those rumors have existed for a while, and I was hoping you would bring up the 4-ounce Muay Thai because that's something I wanted to ask you about. I think that, and there have also been rumors about the UFC resisting trying to get that product, I don't know what legalized essentially in America, because I think if American MMA fans see I've been to One events, And seeing 4 ounce Muay Thai live, especially with the way Americans love striking, it's a different kind of product. And I really think that that's the kind of thing that could bring a sort of, a force multiplier for one in the market.
Well, I will say this. If you're looking for, I mean, this is the problem with PFL. It's like, and it's not what you asked, but you also have to offer, if you're going to be different from UFC, you have to offer like a genuine alternative. And a tournament system is just a clunky, bureaucratic mess. But to the point you raise, 4 ounce Muay Thai, that's a little different to me. Now I realize that within Thai boxing, there are rules and customs and norms around what counts as Thai boxing, what's appropriate etiquette, and I cannot weigh in on that debate. That's so beyond my pay grade. I don't know what to say. But if you're just asking me, like, do I think it's an interesting innovation? Yes. And more to the point, I don't think I've seen a reaction among MMA fans to kickboxing like I have with this, or like, Badr Hari and Rico Verhoeven, like some of the biggest names that kickboxing has. Like, it just instantly works. It instantly works. So I would say that, like, I'd be curious to see if they can get that going, but it's one of those things where, like, oh, why doesn't kickboxing click? And it's like, if there's one version that might, it's like that, which
I'll ask a dumb question, because I have not seen 4 ounce Muay Thai.
No?
What does 4 ounce Muay Thai look like?
It's Muay Thai, and I think there are some changed rules around clinching. I think it's much more designed for kickboxing, where clinching is, I think, somewhat allowed, but let's just say minimized. But they don't have boxing gloves on; they got MMA gloves on, and the knockouts are aplenty, and they are violent, and they are. I mean, you can take a. This is what's interesting about this. I think it's true of combat. Combat sports is always going to be a star-driven business, but I've never seen a sport where you can just line up 24 guys, 12 on a side. You can't even pronounce half their names, and you're just watching, like, incredible, yes, violence, but it's still pretty technical, and it's still pretty athletic, and it just feels like a cool alternative to Muay Thai that's a little bit more in your. I would compare it something akin to rugby sevens. I mean, that's probably not quite right, but you know what I mean? That, like, it's got that kind of up-tempo feel to it, and it's pretty thrilling to watch, to be honest with you.
Yeah, you can do all the same cool stuff that you see in Muay Thai, the incredible technical striking, the high-level defense, the constant action, the penalties for stalling, the foot sweeps. There's less in terms of clinching, and the knockouts are insane. And so it's and look, I'm a jiu-jitsu guy. I'm a self-defense jiu-jitsu guy who's 50 years old, and I think it's awesome. So,
yeah, Stefan, you got to get with the program, man. There's still. I feel like, Stefan, I feel like you're so burned out with how insane martial arts has become. The true reality is there are still some stories, kind of, and some things happening across the combat sports universe, let's say, that are still worth paying attention to.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm a martial artist first, and then a combat sports enthusiast second.
Yeah, fair.
Something like Lethway, which I would never want to practice, and which I would hope that no child of mine would ever practice, is still fascinating to watch, because what lessons can we take away from it? I mean, I don't know if I want to support it financially, but I'll watch it on YouTube. I'm not going to go into an event. It's that weird thing between, the ethically, this is wrong. This is brain damage to the nth degree, as opposed to just normal MMA, which is brain damage, but not as amplified. But it's fascinating. And if you're interested in self-defense, man, there's a lot of lessons there happening in every fight.
What I would say is about 4 ounce Muay Thai is, again, you're not getting, like, the best in the world, I don't think, but you're not getting scrubs either. Like, these seem like talented athletes for the most part. Obviously, pro grade fighters. It's one of those inventions where it feels like it doesn't, like, it just turns the volume up. Yeah, it just kind of turns the volume up in a way where it's still Muay Thai, or I don't know what the proper nomenclature would be under those considerations, but it's got a little bit juice to it. It's not. I don't feel. It's not like going from MMA to power slap. That's not what it is. It's better than that.
So to get back to the Jordan Klepper piece and to the idea of the UFC MMA to MAGA pipeline, you've got your ear very close to the ground. So then, obviously, if you're a neo-Nazi, you're thrilled by what Bryce Mitchell is saying. And if you're a flat earther, you're thrilled by what somebody like Bryce Mitchell is saying. I'm just picking Bryce Mitchell as a placeholder here. But what about the people who are just fight fans? How are you finding that they're reacting to that stuff? Or is it just so peripheral to what they want, which is guys fighting, that it doesn't matter?
So it's a good question. So I'm trying to guess here. I think there are basically three distinct groups, or pretty distinct groups. One would be like when you hear this kind of stuff, I think a lot of people just left. I think that, again, like, the sport is not exactly rolling out the red carpet for a certain kind of fight fan anymore. And I don't have any hard data on this, should be clear about that, but I've got enough of I've got more anecdotal evidence around this than maybe anything else in my life. And yeah, they just left. There was just a group of, the best explanation I can give for that is, Trump shows up for MSG in 2019 for a Diaz and Masvidal fight, and there are some cheers there, but it's a lot of boos too. Let's call it mixed, right? Joe Rogan even has on video, talks about how he got booed, and you heard it. In 2024, he comes back, and it's like a roar. And it's like New York City is still pretty blue. So what happened there? The answer is not that MMA fans all of a sudden just decided that, the same ones that they love Donald Trump. It's that a bunch of them left, and then a bunch of new ones came in, and there is just an ideological homogeneity currently within the fan base, but I think there just a bunch got pushed out. So that's one. And it doesn't happen all at once. Like, it's slow. I've noticed it. Like, the Bryce Mitchell one is one. Trump at UFC 309 was one. Trump at, to forget, like a different one. Like, there's these big waves.
Strickland. The list goes on.
Whoever, where they're like, I just can't take it anymore. Like, it comes like in stages like that, right? So that's the first group. The second group I would say is people who don't like it, but are otherwise, they just don't seem to care, or they just kind of ignore it, or they don't weigh in on it. They may disagree with it, but they're just semi-neutral about it. It's like either they don't care about it, or it's a tax you got to pay to watch a sport that you love or something. And that group might be a little bit bigger than you imagine. I don't think it's the majority, but I don't think it's an utterly insignificant minority whatsoever. I think it's actually a pretty sizable one. It's just they're very quiet, right? By definition, they're just not trying to rock the boat. They're not trying to make it a bigger deal. They just want to watch their MMA, and they'll just tolerate a fair amount of this as like a thing. Now, you might say, well, what kind of person would tolerate it? But like in talking to them, these also are not typically like intensely political people anyway. You know what I mean? They're just average people, in certain ways. And then the other one is just, the kind of group that's either, nominally in favor of it or outright just absolutely loves it. I think the ones that like absolutely love it is a little smaller in terms of the overall whole. But they are noticeable, and, there's just simply no denying that there's just a part of the fan base. Again, well, you also have to note that there can be some that are like, in this is the, you have to accept this. Some that are very pro-Strickland that also might like Bryce, but some might not. Some might like Covington, but not like Strickland. And not just because of who they are as fighters. There can be little, there's not total unanimity in the way you might otherwise think. But if you're asking like how much of the fan base now is, right, and then further on, it's, it's got to be 60, 70%. Like it's, or more. It's significant.
I guess you talked about how, to some extent, some center and some left people, I would include myself in this, as you well know, have been driven out or have just said, okay, man, I can't take this anymore. And that other people have come in. So you're kind of arguing there that MAGA fans came into the sport and non-MAGA fans left the sport. What about
or people who are MAGA adjacent, not explicitly, but otherwise supportive. But, they're not necessarily intensely political in that way.
Sure. What about do you think the sport has any ability to radicalize people? If you're a huge diehard UFC fan and you're following the fighters and you're listening to the podcasts and you're watching the press conferences and you're maybe going to the weigh-ins and you're going to the fights, do you think that has a radicalizing effect on people? If we take a person who's right in the middle of the political spectrum or apolitical, but he loves fighting and he's going to all these events, do you think that person will, on average, be moved to the right? Does the sport itself have a radicalizing effect?
Yeah, it's really hard to know this answer with any degree of certainty. To my knowledge, this has not been measured academically in any kind of way that I'm aware of. Perhaps someone is working on it now, but I don't have any hard data. What I would say is it's simply incomprehensible to me that it's not. If you're a young person, a young man, 18, and again, maybe you don't come from any kind of super political family or ideology in one way, but you're now exposed to these kinds of messages, or the tolerance of these kinds of messages, or outright acceptance of them. You're seeing a constant stream of right-wing political figures being broadcast at some of the biggest events. Some of the biggest podcasts who all have explicitly that right wing are doing MMA content. You know what I mean? I've said this before. Like, I told Jordan Klepper this, and he was like, "Who comes to these shows?" And I was like, "Dude, it's not Hassan Piker. Let me tell you, it's not. It's Candace Owen. You know what I mean? Like, it's Tim Pool. Like, these are people who show up to these fights. Like, on some level, if you sent your kid to the opposite side, if it was the Hassan Pikers, if it was the Mehdi Hassans or whoever, doing this kind of things, would you imagine that it would have some kind of political influence on them? Yes, of course you would. Like, it would be foolish to imagine that it would have no effect, or at a bare minimum to not be curious about whether it had an effect. It's just very hard to say, again, how much is chicken and egg. I do think, though, that so MMA has a problem generally that has nothing to do with the political issue, which is that a famous writer by the name, well, I say famous because I think very highly of him, but by the name of Jonathan Snowden, who's written for all kinds of places and has covered MMA for a long time, and pro wrestling, I think he doesn't cover MMA anymore, but certainly had a long tenure doing it. He kind of had a theory that the MMA fan cycle burns out about every 5 years. And the reason why is you get into MMA, you'll see it. Someone's like, it's this baptism, like, oh my, I said that to Jordan Klepper, like, oh my God, and then they just want to watch everything. And that gets harder over time. It becomes expensive. Some of the friends fall out. If you end up lasting longer than 5 years, let's say you're 25, now you're 30, now you might have kids, now you've got, obligations in a way, your life just kind of takes you in a different direction. Super hardcores always find a way to watch, but there's this kind of core group that just gets cycled out all the time. So I just wonder if part of what's also happening is, if you're a person who is, exposed to right-wing spaces, you're going to get UFC blasted in your face. And that also might be a pipeline to be part of that natural fan replacement that kind of happens. Like, the two things are working in concert in that way. I know it's a long answer, but that's kind of where my head is at.
Okay. So, although the UFC is on a down cycle, you're arguing that being affiliated with MAGA very explicitly is perhaps a financial advantage for them in providing of new fans. Would there be any other advantages?
It's just it's several advantages. I mean, it's a degree of insurance, right? So, like, if there is a downswing, again, if I can make this about who we are versus what I'm selling you transactionally, that's a powerful thing. It's a question of how successful they can make that. But if that's actually what's happening, that's a big deal. Like, you can do that for a while. So it gives them insulation against potentially some of these, bigger. Partly this issue is, again, unrelated to the electoral slant that the company took. TKO, we don't really talk about this. Everyone talks about the big sell-off they had in 2016 to WME, and then WME is always still kind of connected to TKO, but it's different now. Like, this is not WME from 2016 to 2021, 22 made a bunch of good decisions. And it feels like we're in a very different place with that. That's irrespective of any kind of political question. Like, you didn't really ask about it, but I feel like drives a significant amount. But antitrust, if you're hosting Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, if you're hosting, well, I guess he's on the outs now, but Elon Musk, and you're hosting Bobby Kennedy and, or what am I saying? RFK, you're hosting, whoever, all these figures of power, and Donald Trump, is their DOJ and their FTC really going to go after you? I have my doubts, right?
Much less likely to in any
exactly.
event.
And again, they're trying to get federal legislation changed on the boxing side. They want to go in and change the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act. Having a powerful senators on your side could be deeply instrumental. So, like, there clearly is a very important relationship to be had there if you're the UFC.
Yeah, Nate Corey's been on our podcast and my personal podcast as well, and has talked about the the importance of having senators on your side, because ultimately those people are going to be voting for and driving that legislation forward, and then voting for or against it. And if you lose the support of those guys, it's going to be dead in the water.
Which is what happened to they wanted to get the Ali Act extended to MMA. They had Mark Wayne Mullen, who was originally a representative in the House, and then he got elected senator. But then what's kind of interesting was he was the one, because he's kind of known as like ultra MAGA, which he is. But he was the one when he was a congressman who brought in like Mark Ratner from the UFC, was holding his feet to the fire, was going after Lawrence Epstein. Like these are big figures in the UFC, and he was holding them to account, and he was going to get MMA extended. And even though he was a Republican, because at the time there wasn't that explicit kind of connection between the two, and he was a former fighter who felt like he'd seen what promoters can do to fighters and how that relationship can be abusive. But then, his political ambition switches, and the kind of world he lived in terms of what was in and what was out, and like what kind of people you were working with, that completely changed. So he just let it go. I guess it didn't mean much to him in the end.
Well, I've got one more question for you, because I feel like I've been hogging the questions. So I'm going to pass it over to Jeff. But a couple of months ago, Kash Patel was talking about using the UFC training centers to train FBI agents. And this just seems like a way to funnel money, taxpayer money, into the pockets of the UFC training centers. Has that gone ahead at all, or was that just empty talk?
Dana White seemed to take it seriously. He certainly didn't dismiss it when he was asked about it. I think he said that they would talk, and he was interested, and of course they'd make their resources available to the FBI and see what could happen. What could happen, but I haven't heard any subsequent reporting or heard any industry rumblings around it. The UFC again, or more broadly, I should say, I keep saying UFC, but it's TKO. They're just big fans of these contracts from tourism boards, from places like these kingdoms in Saudi Arabia, or these repressive governments in Azerbaijan. Like, they love, if there's it doesn't have to be them. Australia is doing it too. It doesn't have to be necessarily repressive governments, but the point is taking government money as a way to put just making that a significant way in which you do business. Like, pay us $20 million, we'll bring a UFC pay-per-view, and we'll bring WWE in like the same weekend to your city, and they'll get massive payouts from these cities or these other municipalities to do that. And
how massive?
I mean, it depends on the deal, but these are not deals for like a few million. These are in the teens and higher than 20 million if we're talking a UFC and a WWE event. There's a lot of money involved here. It may be for several events. I think Australia was like 16 million or maybe 18 million for 3 events. So, it's still, they're still getting a few things for it, but they're not packaging these deals in small amounts.
I want to return to a couple of things that you said before about the PFL as well, where you talked about how the tournament format doesn't necessarily, it's not conducive to an improved product, even though it may seem to a casual to be different. One thing I've noticed in MMA is markets can transform, and the reason why people watch can change, right? And as you mentioned, to return to another thing you mentioned, if the audience may cycle off every 5 years or so. And one thing I notice is a lot of us that have been watching this a long time grew up watching the Pride Grand Prix and grew up watching the early UFCs, which were tournament format. And do you think that, like, one of the things that I think is powerful in a lot of these right-wing spaces is an appeal to nostalgia? And do you think that that's a factor there, that people are like, this is what it was like when I started watching it, we're going to try to go back to that, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't?
I mean, the UFC has gotten a lot better about honoring its history, but they're not really a nostalgia-driven company. I'll give them credit. I think they used to make no effort at like honoring their history, and they've gotten a lot better about that, and we should be honest about it. But at the same time, they're just intensely youth-focused. Intensely. Like, that's where all their energy is. They're constantly thinking about the young, the next. They're not really trying to get to a product, I think, that's heavy on nostalgia. There may be a change to that, but I guess we'll see. To the broader point, tournaments in MMA can work. But a couple things you got to keep in mind. Like, one of the things that works better is when there's multiple fights in a night. It doesn't have to be the whole tournament, but if you do the semis and the finals in one night, that tends to be much more palatable to MMA fan. In fact, it can add a degree of intrigue and they will be even more invested, right? It actually works in that scenario, or doing it, in a kind of limited way over a short calendar for every once in a while. We'll do it for one weight class in the summer, and then that's it. That kind of thing can work too. But just as this is how our product works. It's so over, on one level, romanticism could drive certain decisions. On another one, there are just some core fundamentals to how the fight business works that you see people stray from because they're out of ideas. They think that this is why monopoly is bad, because if you have one monopoly having everything, it forces people into what I call fake innovation. Or let's change it up, let's innovate it. And it's man, nobody wants that. They just want to see the best fight the best. You can rearrange it a little bit at the margins for sure. But if you don't have access to the best, then what do you have? Oh, let's have our fighters juggle with chainsaws because you got nothing else to go on.
I'm interested in whether you read Albert Samaha's piece in the Washington Post, where he followed around some UFC fans, and none of them are what we would call hardcores. Albert himself's not a hardcore, but when we talk about these being right-wing spaces, I think something you said earlier about the average fan is not an ideologue. I don't think personally. I think it's a person that's hey, I'm here for spectacle. I'm here for friendship. This seems like an interesting sport. It's a masculinized space, and so young men are driven to it. It's a youth-driven business. They're looking for those guys in the 18 to 25 demographic. One of the things that I'm interested as in terms of a solutions piece is I don't think that the left should cede masculinity to the right. In fact, I think that it is suicidal to do so. And what's interesting to me is to see masculinity defined as this sort of dominance masculinity as opposed to this other aspects of masculinity anti-bullying masculinity, the strong protecting the weak masculinity. And one of the things that I saw in that piece, which again, apologies if you haven't read it, but the guys
I've read it.
Okay, amazing. Okay, awesome. One of the things that leapt out at me, I'm interested in your take on this, is that the guys that are not, they have political opinions, but they're not deeply held beliefs, and they're not certainly people that go up and down the ballot. And the things that they continually said were, we're looking for authenticity. And that is one thing that I think is found in MMA, because there is a truth to violence. There is an authenticity there. And that's what they're looking for in politics as well. So I'm wondering, are those things are those sentiments you agree with? And can there be a path for us to think through ways to, I don't know that we'll ever totally transform the space, but is this is this an idea worth exploring to you?
I do. I think most of that is, or basically all of that is quite correct. There's a lot to unpack there. I think I would just focus in on. I certainly agree. It's an interesting conversation to have, because I have to tell you that I don't believe in trying to sell. I do believe in trying to sell young men on a kind of masculinity that's built on, what it means to have strength in, for example, not just, but through fatherhood, or strength in taking care of others through service, self as well, clearly, but, in this kind of uplifting way. I don't think you should not sell that. But I don't think you can actually sell that as a full-on alternative up front, because the domineering form of masculinity is intensely more intoxicating for these people. And what I think you actually have to do, and if you're asking me how we do this, I have no earthly clue, not one. You actually have to take that back from them. You have to kind of make them see that there's a part of that you can take that's good, but you don't need the whole thing. But I don't think you can just move on from it, because what they see that as, and I'll be honest, it's when I was 24, how I saw it is strength of self. It is projection of self. It is, maybe you didn't feel seen growing up. Maybe maybe the weight room has done a lot for your confidence. Maybe, these kinds of things where these intensely masculine environments, they produced something in you or in these young men that really is powerfully resonating. I think trying to sell them oh yeah, but here's, it's sure, you like Coke, but we have Diet Coke. And of course, that's not the reality of what it is, but I think they see it that way. And so how do you make them not see it that way? How do you make the other versions of masculinity both more appealing, and also to take something about the investing in oneself and the strength and power that comes with it, without resorting to also I hate, or someone declaring their hate for the world, or just turning in a toxic direction. I actually feel like that's you have to take what they like and refashion it all in different terms rather than selling alternatives. I don't think alternatives are going to work.
How much of that would be competition? I mean, you could have Jeff and I have both competed in jiu-jitsu, right? That's one vision of masculinity, I would say. So maybe the competition thing and that strength of self can be reflected through there.
One of the things that I do think we could work on is the thing what Jeff, you had said previously, namely, just not ceding masculinity to them. I think one thing that helps a lot of people, believe it or not, seeing is believing. Seeing somebody who has maybe what a young person would consider to be traditional forms of, I don't know, masculinity, masculine significance, whatever the terminology might be, but then doesn't employ those tools in the world in a way that is nasty and, misogynist or whatever. He employs them in a way that seems cool, unique, and also like healthy and balanced and rooted in something. I think that's, again, how you get there is make sure that people who are like-minded like you also realize that there's benefits for them in training in these worlds, and then people can see each other in these roles that if otherwise they would have to imagine it. Well, if they imagine it, they're going to imagine probably some caricature, or it'll be difficult for them to imagine it all. But then when you see it, you're like, oh my God, that's not what I thought at all. And I think just living through these places can be quite powerful.
Unfortunately, in the modern day and age, to have any kind of reach, you need to be living and doing these things publicly. And that really means online. So then do you have this giant infrastructure and amplification structure to amplify that? Of course, I mean, the UFC is going to and other organizations like it are going to amplify, on average, right-wing and MAGA guys doing manly shit. So then there's this massive, if you go look for people doing manly shit online, the guy's probably going to be some right-wing lunatic.
This is true. Yes. I mean, there are bigger issues at play, but I just feel like, I understand. So how many articles did you see in the 2010s of people being like, the gym is, if you're a right-wing asshole, you might be a gym bro, and like all these ways in which they demonize the gym. And it's not even like I disagree. It's not even like I think it's wrong. However, that's not the point. The point is, how many articles did that come out and basically signal to people on the right, well, the left wants nothing to do with this world, and to people on the left being like, well, I want nothing to do with that world. And now there's this like intensification of self-segregation. How does that benefit anybody who wants to change some of these spaces, or just at least not cede them to the forces that currently direct them? It totally backfired. And so I just feel like changing that impulse, even if I recognize there's a certain truth value to what they're talking about, living in them is going to have, in these spaces, is going to have a significantly greater impact than just see. Again, the plan this whole time has been just cede the territory to these jokers and then let them have their ear. Well, how has that worked out? Not that great.
Well, if we ever have you on again, we're all going to have to go shirtless, oiled up, and have our array of guns behind us and a whole bunch of other symbols. And that's how we'll break through. That's my cunning plan that cannot fail.
To be clear, let me backtrack a little bit, which is you also don't have to live just like them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you don't have to be like, oh, I like the same things you like in every way. I really don't mean that. But if your uniting force is martial arts, you have that. And that's pretty big. For a lot of people, that's quite big. There's that as well. But it's more just there's a soft influence that comes with presence. And
soft power, one might say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a soft power that comes with proximity. And for at least the people who do get out of the house, making roll call, I think is quite important.
Yeah, I think that's very astute. And the thing is, all of these things, these like being this positive example, not ceding these spaces, showing up, and like sort of living those values in a way in public. These are absolutely necessary. And I think what frustrates people is that these are long-term solutions. And for every solution that you want, for every problem you have, there's a simple answer that's totally wrong and it's not going to work. And so I think a lot of times, it's like jiu-jitsu itself. It's a struggle between what's right and what's easy. We know what we have to do. We just got to do it consistently.
Yeah, I know. It's the eternal question. Well, I know what I have to do, but, well, this is going to be a Herculean effort to get there. I mean, the other part, too, is, I live in Washington, D.C. I've seen these various left-wing institutions devoted to, any number of causes, electoral or otherwise, being like, we got to find our Joe Rogan of the left, or just more broadly, how do we re-engage young men? And it's like these people who, it's like, dude, I'm a 45-year-old guy. I'm barely connected to these young guy spaces, and I'm like miles ahead of all of you people. You're not even, and then they're putting up PowerPoint presentations about their plan. It's like, it just seemed, these are nice people, but this is a path to nothingness. We are deep in a place here, but we just have to recognize it for what it is and realize that like substantive change comes with, substantive understandings of how you should live. I don't think it's anything less than that.
Yeah, as I don't mean for this to sound bleak in any respect. I just mean for this to sound strategic. But the right had a decades-long organizing effort where they were in the wilderness for a long time and they had plans. Maybe they had PowerPoints too. I don't know. But they knew it would take a certain amount of time, and they did. And credit to them, they did the work to get there, and the culture shift happened. And now it's on us to do something a little better.
Got to wrestle it back. You got to underhook and start building height. That's what we got to do.
Can't I just catch a sneaky loop choke? Maybe.
maybe. Yeah. We'll see what happens.
Thank you so much, Luke. Where can people find you? Obviously, there's the Today Show episode, but when people want to follow your MMA commentary and your combat sports commentary, how do they do that?
Yeah, two places principally. You can go to, I have the Morning Combat podcast, which is I'm obviously quite proud of, but my personal efforts, you can go to youtube.com/Luke Thomas, or I'm also on Substack. I forget exactly what my URL is, but just Google me or search me, Luke Thomas on Substack.
Thank you so much, and good luck with all your efforts.
Thank you for having me.